The streets of Soho were heavy that afternoon, grey skies, cold wind, and the restless rhythm of London in winter. Near the corner of a small cafe, a man sat on the pavement, his back pressed against the brick wall, clutching a paper cup that was nearly empty. His coat was torn, his hands red from the cold. Hundreds of shoes passed by, clicking and shuffling, yet not a single pair slowed down. The man's eyes followed them one by one, not in anger, but in quiet resignation. He had learned long ago that in this city, invisibility was a kind of survival. Inside the cafe, warmth and conversation floated through the glass. The man could smell the roasted coffee beans, could almost feel the heat on his fingertips, but the door remained closed to him, as it had been for years. Every face that passed reflected the same pattern: avoidance, discomfort, denial. To the world, he had become a shadow, something between existence and disappearance. He shifted his weight, pulling his knees closer to his chest as a gust of wind swept down the street. The air bit at his skin. His sign, a piece of damp cardboard, had the words barely legible: "Just trying to get back on my feet." No one read it. He looked at it for a moment and smiled faintly, a sad, tired smile, the kind that hides more stories than it reveals. As the light began to fade, the man lowered his head, resting his chin on his knees. Somewhere, a car horn blared, a bus hissed to a stop, and the crowd flowed endlessly. To them, he didn't exist, but fate, or perhaps compassion, was about to stop for the first time that day. It was almost dusk when the door of the studio opened just across the street. Freddie Mercury stepped out, wrapped in a long, dark coat and wearing his signature aviator sunglasses. The day had been long, endless takes, fine-tuning vocals, and the usual chaos that followed every Queen recording session. He pulled the collar of his coat higher against the wind and took a deep breath. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the city breathe around him. As he began to walk toward the corner, his gaze caught something, or rather, someone. The man on the pavement, the one everyone else seemed to avoid. Freddie slowed down, watching from a distance. The man's stillness struck him. Not the kind of stillness that comes from peace, but from exhaustion. Something in the scene pulled at him, quietly but firmly. It wasn't pity that he felt, but recognition, a strange reflection of himself in another's loneliness. The people around kept moving, brushing past him, unaware that Freddie Mercury, the voice that had filled stadiums, had stopped in the middle of Soho, not for applause, but for silence. He removed his sunglasses, eyes softening as they focused on the man. For a second, he hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. Then, without overthinking it, he crossed the street. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the cold pavement. The man didn't look up right away. Freddie stood there for a heartbeat, watching him quietly, a global icon facing someone the world had chosen not to see. In that small space between fame and anonymity, humanity waited to be rediscovered. Freddie stopped just a few feet away and looked down. The man finally noticed him, first through the reflection in the cafe window, then directly. His eyes widened slightly, as if unsure whether what he saw was real. But Freddie didn't speak. He simply lowered himself to the pavement and sat beside him, his back against the same cold wall. The movement drew a few curious glances from passers-by, but Freddie didn't care. For once, he wasn't performing. He was just there. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The air between them filled with the hum of the city. Car horns, muffled voices, the clinking of coffee cups inside the cafe. Freddie crossed his arms and tilted his head back, staring at the grey sky as if it carried all the answers he'd never found. The man beside him seemed hesitant, glancing now and then, still trying to understand the situation. Finally, Freddie broke the silence, not with words, but with a soft hum. A faint melody escaped his lips, so gentle it blended into the sound of the street. It wasn't a song anyone would recognize, just a few wandering notes that floated and disappeared into the cold evening air. The man looked at him again, and for the first time, his face softened. Freddie turned slightly and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need language. "It's not so bad sitting here," he said quietly, almost to himself. The man nodded, unsure what to reply, but something changed in his eyes. That distant, defeated look began to fade. For the first time in a long time, someone had chosen to share the silence with him, and that, somehow, was enough. The silence between them slowly turned into something gentle. The man, finally, spoke, his voice rough from the cold and from years of not being heard. "Didn't think anyone would sit here," he muttered, staring at the pavement. Freddie looked over, a small smile forming. "Well," he said softly, "it looked like a good spot." That broke the tension. The man let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. They talked quietly, words blending with the hum of the city. The man told his story in fragments. He'd once worked fixing motorcycles in East London, lost the job, then the flat, then his rhythm. "Once you fall behind here," he said, "the city doesn't wait for you." Freddie listened, truly listened, without interruption or pity. He nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I know what it's like," he said, "to feel surrounded by people but still completely alone." The man looked at him, curious. "You? Lonely?" Freddie chuckled, resting his elbows on his knees. "Fame's a funny thing. It fills rooms but empties hearts if you let it." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "Sometimes I think people cheer so loud because they don't want to hear their own silence." The man nodded, his eyes thoughtful. A moment passed between them, not of sadness, but of understanding. It was the kind of connection that didn't belong to money, status, or fame, just two human beings, each carrying a different kind of weight, finding brief rest in each other's company. For a while, it felt like the world had finally stopped rushing. As the minutes passed, Freddie noticed the man shivering. His coat was too thin for the London cold, and his fingers were trembling as he tried to hold the paper cup steady. Without a word, Freddie stood up and walked into the cafe. The man lowered his eyes again, assuming that was the end of it, just another brief moment of kindness that would fade into the noise of the city. But a few minutes later, Freddie returned. In his hands were 2 steaming cups of coffee and a small brown paper bag. "Hope you like sugar," he said, handing one to the man. The man took it carefully as though it might vanish if he blinked. They sat again, shoulder to shoulder, sipping the coffee in silence. Freddie opened the bag, revealing 2 sandwiches, and offered one. "Haven't eaten either," he said with a grin. "Seems fair we fix that." They ate slowly, without hurry. For the first time in a long time, the man wasn't eating alone. There was no pity in Freddie's eyes, only warmth. The old kind of quiet understanding that restores dignity. Between bites, they spoke about little things, favorite songs, rainy days, the feeling of missing home. The man mentioned a place he used to live, near the river, and how he dreamed of having a room again. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a bed. Freddie listened carefully, then nodded. "I think everyone deserves that," he said softly. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small notepad, and wrote something down. Tearing. The page carefully, he folded it and placed it into the man's hand. "Tomorrow," he said, looking into his eyes, "someone will come for you. Trust them." The man opened his mouth to ask what it meant, but Freddie only smiled. "It's time someone waited for you for a change." The next morning, the man woke to the same cold wind, the same city noise, and the same uncertainty. He reached into his pocket and felt the folded piece of paper Freddie had given him. For a long time, he stared at it, unsure whether to believe in what it promised. He'd been disappointed too many times before. Still, something about Freddie's voice, calm, certain, almost fatherly, made him hold on to a small spark of hope. By noon, the street was busier than usual. People hurried past with scarves around their necks, clutching newspapers and briefcases. The man sat quietly, eyes down, when a black car slowed to a stop by the curb. The driver, wearing a long coat, stepped out and called his name. His real name, one he hadn't heard spoken kindly in years. For a second he froze, then the driver smiled and said, "Mr. Mercury asked me to find you." The man's heart raced. He hesitated, looking around, half expecting it to be a mistake. But the driver opened the door gently. Inside, on the seat, there was a folded blanket, a clean coat, and an envelope with his name written in neat handwriting. He climbed in slowly, his hands trembling not from cold, but from disbelief. As the car moved through the streets of London, he pressed the envelope to his chest. Inside were enough bills to pay for several months at a small boarding house in Kensington, and a short note, "You deserve warmth. Start here." There was no signature, only a small drawn crown at the bottom of the page. The man closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry. Days turned into weeks, and the man began to rebuild his life, one quiet step at a time. The small room in Kensington wasn't luxurious. The wallpaper was old, the window a bit drafty, but to him it felt like a palace. Each morning he would wake up and sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city move below. For the first time in years, he had somewhere to return to, a bed to sleep in, and a door he could lock behind him. With the help of the driver, who returned once more following Freddie's instructions, he found a job doing maintenance at a small theatre in West London. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. Every time he fixed a light or repaired a broken chair, he thought about that evening in Soho, about the man who had seen him when no one else would. There were days when he still doubted himself, but the memory of that moment gave him strength. One afternoon, while cleaning backstage, he found an envelope tucked into a toolbox. It had no name, no address, only a familiar small crown drawn on the back. Inside was a single note, written in the same elegant handwriting. "Keep going. The world still has room for you." He sat on the wooden floor, holding the paper with trembling hands, smiling through tears. He never saw Freddie again. There were no visits, no cameras, no reminders, only that quiet connection that had changed everything. Each night, as the lights of the theatre dimmed, he whispered a silent thank you to the man who had reminded him that compassion could still exist in a world that had forgotten how to look. Months passed, and life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. The man had found stability, but more than that, he had found dignity again. Sometimes, while sweeping the theatre's hall after a late performance, he would hear one of Freddie's songs playing faintly from someone's radio outside. He'd stop, close his eyes, and feel a gentle warmth in his chest. It wasn't about fame or gratitude. It was about remembering the moment when someone had seen him as human again. One evening, he saved enough to buy a small record player from a second-hand shop. The first vinyl he found was "Somebody to Love." He played it in his tiny room, letting the music fill the space that had once been silent. As Freddie's voice soared through the walls, the man smiled softly. There was a line in the song that struck him differently now. "I work hard every day of my life. I work till I ache in my bones." He understood it in a way only someone who had been to the bottom could. Meanwhile, Freddie never spoke publicly about that day in Soho. He didn't need to. To those close to him, he simply said once, "I met someone who reminded me that the world is only as kind as we choose to make it." Then he moved on, quietly continuing to help others behind the scenes, funding shelters, supporting local causes, always away from cameras. Compassion for him was never a performance. Years later, when the man heard of Freddie's passing, he sat alone in his little room and cried. Again, not because he had lost an idol, but because he had once been seen by a man whose heart was greater than his fame. And though the world would never know their story, he carried that kindness within him for the rest of his life. Proof that one quiet act of humanity could echo forever.